Imagine a world where the slightest fever could mean the end of your life. A world where a simple cut might turn deadly, and where healers relied on herbs, prayers, and theories of the body that sound strange to us today. This was the world of medieval medicine, a place where hope, faith, and trial and error guided the treatment of sickness and injury. In this journey tonight, we'll explore why you wouldn't last a single day without medieval medicine, and what life looked like when every illness was a gamble. Welcome to Asterisk History for Sleep Asterisk. If you're new here, I invite you to subscribe to the channel so you never miss one of our calming dives into the past. I'd also love to hear from you. Leave a comment telling me what topics you're most interested in and when you usually listen in. Do you press play at bedtime, during restless nights, or in the quiet of the afternoon? Your thoughts and stories not only inspire me, they help shape the future of this channel. Tonight's episode will take us deep into the world of healing in the Middle Ages. We'll look at how people tried to balance the mysterious four humors in the body, how monks and midwives worked with herbs and prayers, and how surgeons braved the terrifying world of cutting, bleeding, and sometimes even amputations with no anesthesia. We'll explore the plague doctors and their strange beaked masks, the magic and superstition woven into medical beliefs, and the way society fought back against epidemics. All of this will be told slowly, softly, and in a way designed to ease your mind and help you relax. Whether you drift into sleep halfway through or stay with me until the end, let this be your companion in rest. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let us begin our long journey into the strange, fascinating, and sometimes frightening world of medieval medicine. To understand why medieval medicine was so vital, we first need to step into the fragile world of health that existed in those centuries. Imagine living without the modern safety nets we take for granted today. No antibiotics to fight infections, no vaccinations to guard against deadly epidemics, no pharmacies filled with rows of neatly labeled remedies. Life in the Middle Ages was lived at the edge of uncertainty. Every ache, every fever, every wound, no matter how small, had the potential to turn fatal. The medieval world was one where the average lifespan was far shorter than ours, though numbers can be misleading. Many people died in infancy, and women faced constant risks during childbirth. Diseases we consider mild or treatable now, such as strep throat or an ear infection, could spiral into something life-threatening. Even the common cold could develop into pneumonia, and without antibiotics, the body's ability to recover depended entirely on luck, diet, and the healer's chosen remedy. People in the Middle Ages did not understand germs, bacteria, or viruses. The microscopic world was a complete mystery, and yet illness was everywhere. Instead of germ theory, they turned to ideas inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, theories that tried to explain sickness through the balance of fluids, the will of God, or the alignment of the stars. To be sick was often seen not just as a physical issue, but also as a spiritual one. Illness could be considered punishment for sin or a test of faith, and treatment often involved both prayer and medicine. Hygiene in the medieval period was also far different from what we practice now. Bathing was rare in many regions, not always because people disliked it, but because access to clean, warm water was limited, and at times, bathing was even discouraged by authorities who feared it spread disease. Streets in medieval towns were filled with refuse, and sewage disposal was often crude. Rats and fleas thrived in these conditions, carrying diseases like the bubonic plague that devastated Europe in the 14th century. Diet played a large role in health. The poor, who made up the majority of the population, lived mainly on bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was a rare luxury for many, and milk often spoiled quickly. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, leaving people vulnerable to disease. Meanwhile, the wealthy feasted on rich foods heavy with meat and spice, which could lead to digestive troubles and gout. Healers of the time believed that diet directly influenced the body's balance of humors. So much attention was paid to food as both cause and cure. Accidents were another constant threat. Imagine working in the fields with sharp tools or in a medieval workshop with iron, wood, and fire. A cut could easily become infected. A broken bone could heal badly, leaving someone crippled for life. There were no emergency rooms, no sterile bandages, and little understanding of how to properly clean a wound. In such a world, medicine was not optional, it was a desperate necessity, even if its methods sometimes did more harm than good. But while the dangers were constant, so too was human ingenuity. People did not simply accept illness and death without a fight. Across Europe, countless remedies were recorded, often passed down orally from one generation to the next. Some of these treatments relied on herbs with real medicinal properties: garlic for infection, willow bark for pain. Others leaned on ritual and superstition, using charms, prayers, or even the phases of the moon as guides for healing. In monasteries, monks carefully copied ancient medical texts, keeping alive the knowledge of Galen and Hippocrates, while in towns, barber-surgeons honed their craft with knives and saws. Living in this world meant walking a fine line between hope and despair. Illness could strike at any time, and survival often depended on the healer's skill, the availability of remedies, and sheer fortune. It was a time when people clung tightly to any form of explanation, whether spiritual or medical, because to understand illness was to have a small measure of control over it. The fragile world of medieval health set the stage for everything else we will explore. Without the constant threat of disease and injury, there would have been no desperate search for cures, no elaborate systems of healing, no peculiar rituals that to us seem more like magic than medicine. As you let these thoughts settle, imagine yourself in that world where every breath of air carried unseen dangers, and every day was a delicate balance between survival and surrender. And now, with the fragile health of the medieval world in mind, let us move deeper into the heart of their medical understanding, into the theory that shaped centuries of treatment and belief, the mysterious system of the four humors. At the very heart of medieval medicine lay a theory inherited from the ancient world, one that shaped how illness and health were understood for centuries. This was the theory of the four humors, a system developed by Hippocrates and expanded upon by Galen, the great physicians of ancient Greece and Rome. Though we know today that the body works through organs, blood vessels, and microscopic cells, in the Middle Ages, the human form was seen as a delicate balance of fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these four humors were in harmony, a person would be healthy. But if one grew too strong or too weak, sickness followed. The language of the humors was woven into every aspect of medieval medicine. Blood was associated with warmth and moisture, and thought to be connected to the element of air. Phlegm was cold and wet, tied to water. Yellow bile was hot and dry, linked to fire, while black bile was cold and dry, tied to the element of earth. Each humor had not only a physical quality, but also an emotional and even spiritual influence. A person with too much blood was said to be cheerful and optimistic, while excess black bile made one melancholic. Too much yellow bile produced anger, and too much phlegm made one sluggish or apathetic. In this way, medicine in the Middle Ages was not just about healing the body, it was about shaping the personality and even the soul. When a person fell ill, healers turned to the humors to explain why. A fever might be seen as an excess of blood or bile, while a lingering sadness could be diagnosed as too much black bile. The cure, then, was to restore balance. This might be done through diet, by adjusting the foods a person ate to counteract the dominant humor. Cold and wet phlegm might be treated with hot, dry spices. A sanguine person, full of blood, might be told to eat cooling foods like lettuce or cucumbers. Healing was as much about what went on the plate as what went into the body as medicine. But more dramatic methods were often employed as well. Bloodletting, one of the most common treatments of the Middle Ages, was based directly on the theory of the humors. If sickness came from an excess of blood, the obvious solution was to drain it away. Leeches were applied, or veins were opened with a knife, and the patient would be bled until the physician decided enough had been removed. Sometimes this practice offered relief, particularly if the body had been swollen or feverish, but more often it left the patient weak and vulnerable to further infection. Purgatives and emetics were also common. If the problem was thought to be bile, then the patient might be given a substance to cause vomiting or diarrhea, expelling the excess fluid. These treatments were harsh and unpleasant, but they fit neatly within the framework of humoral theory. To the medieval mind, sickness was a matter of imbalance, and healing came from restoring equilibrium, even if it meant suffering in the process. The humors also explained why certain people were naturally different from others. Personality itself was seen as an expression of humor. A sanguine person was sociable and lively, a choleric person fiery and aggressive, a melancholic person thoughtful, but prone to sadness, and a phlegmatic person calm, perhaps even dull. Physicians saw their work as not only treating disease, but also guiding individuals toward the proper balance in life. The stars, the seasons, and the time of year were all thought to influence which humors dominated, making medicine a practice that combined the natural, the celestial, and the spiritual all at once. It may seem strange to us now, but the theory of the four humors was elegant in its simplicity. It offered explanations for everything from headaches to heartache, from fevers to fits of rage. It was a system that could be applied to every person, and it gave healers a framework for their treatments in a world that lacked microscopes and modern science. The humors made sense of mystery, and that sense of order was as comforting as it was limiting. Of course, the theory was not always harmless. Many patients weakened under repeated bleedings or suffered from aggressive purges that left them dehydrated. Yet the persistence of the four humors shows how deeply people need explanations, even if those explanations are flawed. Without knowledge of germs or bacteria, the humors filled the void, and for centuries they shaped the course of European medicine. As you rest and picture this world, imagine a healer standing at the bedside, holding the hand of a fevered patient. He looks at the tongue, checks the pulse, and studies the color of the skin. To him, these are signs of imbalance, hints of which humor has taken control. And with steady hands, he prepares his remedies, believing he is restoring harmony to the fragile body before him. From this foundation, all of medieval medicine grew. Monks, midwives, surgeons, and physicians alike built their practices on the language of humors. And even as new remedies emerged, the theory remained a guiding force. It is here, in the monasteries, that we next find some of the most dedicated keepers of healing knowledge, the men who copied texts, grew herbs, and prayed for the health of their communities. When we think of medicine in the Middle Ages, our minds often turn to the image of monks in their quiet monasteries, moving carefully among shelves of books and gardens of herbs. And indeed, it was within these religious houses that much of Europe's medical knowledge was preserved and practiced. In a time when literacy was rare, monasteries served as centers of learning, and the monks within them became not only caretakers of the soul, but also healers of the body. A monastery in the Middle Ages was more than a place of prayer. It was a community unto itself, often self-sufficient, with fields for growing crops, workshops for making tools, and gardens where medicinal plants were cultivated with great care. The cloister gardens, carefully tended by the brothers, produced herbs like sage, rosemary, mint, and lavender, each believed to hold curative powers. These gardens were not simply for beauty. They were pharmacies and green, living stores of remedies that could be gathered and prepared for the sick. Inside the monastery, the scriptorium hummed with quiet industry. Monks bent over parchment, painstakingly copying the great medical texts of the past. Works by Hippocrates, Galen, and later, Arabic scholars like Avicenna found their way into Latin through the labor of these scribes. Without their efforts, much of the ancient medical knowledge that shaped Europe would have been lost. In preserving and transmitting these ideas, monasteries became bridges between the classical world and the medieval one, ensuring that theories like the four humors continued to influence healing. But the monks were not merely scholars. They also tended to the sick within their walls, and often those in the surrounding community. A guest house or infirmary was a common feature of a monastery, offering shelter and care to travelers, pilgrims, and the ill. In these spaces, the brothers combined prayer with practical remedies. A fevered patient might be given a tisane brewed from herbs, while at the same time, prayers were said for their recovery. For the monks, healing the body and saving the soul were intertwined duties, each reinforcing the other. The treatments themselves ranged widely. Simple salves and ointments were made by crushing herbs into pastes, often mixed with animal fats or oils to help them bind. Honey, with its natural antibacterial qualities, was used to dress wounds, though the monks did not understand why it worked, only that it often did. Infusions of herbs could ease coughs or soothe digestion. At times, rituals and blessings were added, for illness was often seen as a spiritual affliction as much as a physical one. A cure, therefore, might involve both the hands of the healer and the prayers of the entire brotherhood. The monastic approach to healing was gentle compared to some of the harsher practices outside the cloister walls. While physicians in towns might prescribe strong purges or bleedings, monks often leaned on nature's remedies and careful observation. This did not mean their treatments were always effective, but they offered comfort and care in an age when many had little else. For the sick, the monastery could be a place of refuge, where kindness and attention accompanied the hope of recovery. Monks also believed that caring for the sick was a sacred duty, a reflection of Christ's teachings to heal the suffering. To tend to a patient was an act of service, one that carried spiritual weight. Illness, after all, was often thought of as a trial from God, and to help someone through it was to participate in a holy act. This gave healing a dimension beyond the physical, turning it into a work of faith as well as medicine. Of course, monasteries were not without their limitations. Their remedies were shaped by the same humoral theories that guided all medieval medicine, and they sometimes relied on treatments that offered little real help. Yet the combination of careful herbcraft, prayer, and compassion made their healing work unique. In many ways, the monasteries kept alive a tradition of holistic care, treating not only the symptoms, but also the spirit of the person before them. Imagine the quiet of a monastic infirmary. Stone walls cool and shaded, the faint scent of rosemary and thyme drifting from the garden outside. A monk in simple robes moved from bed to bed, offering a cup of herbal tea here, whispering a prayer there. For the weary patient, the setting itself brought peace. Even if the cure was uncertain, the care was real, and in a world where illness was constant, that mattered deeply. The monasteries remind us that medicine in the Middle Ages was never only about science or theory. It was also about faith, compassion, and the belief that healing the body and healing the soul were inseparable. And as we leave the cloisters behind, we step into the wider world of remedies drawn from nature itself, the herbs and plants that formed the backbone of medieval healing. In a time when there were no laboratories, no pharmacies, and no shelves lined with bottled medicines, the natural world was the greatest resource for healing. Herbs, roots, flowers, and even common kitchen ingredients were transformed into cures by those who knew how to gather and prepare them. To the medieval healer, every plant carried a secret, and nature itself was a vast pharmacy waiting to be explored. Herbal knowledge was passed down through generations, often orally, but also recorded in manuscripts known as herbals. These books, sometimes illustrated with careful drawings of plants, listed their properties and uses. For example, garlic was prized for its ability to ward off infection and strengthen the body. Willow bark with its natural salicylic acid, could ease pain and lower fevers, much like aspirin today. Lavender soothed the nerves and calmed the mind, while mint aided digestion. Even nettles, though stinging to the touch, were boiled into teas thought to cleanse the blood. But herbs were not only chosen for their physical properties. Their shape, color, and even the way they grew were believed to reveal their purpose. This idea, known as the doctrine of signatures, suggested that God had marked each plant with clues to its use. A walnut, shaped like a brain, was thought to help with head ailments. Yellow plants were linked to bile and liver problems, while red plants were seen as good for blood. Though not scientifically accurate, this belief gave healers a way to connect the visible world of plants to the invisible mysteries of the body. Preparation was as important as selection. Herbs could be steeped into teas, crushed into poultices, dried and powdered, or infused in oils and wines. A healer might gather chamomile flowers at dawn, dry them carefully, and later brew them into a calming tea. Roots might be boiled into strong decoctions, bitter but powerful. Honey, with its natural sweetness and preserving quality, was often mixed into remedies, both for its taste and its healing effect. Alcohol, too, was used to extract the essence of herbs, creating tinctures that could be stored for months. Herbs were not just for treating illness once it appeared. They were also used to prevent it. People wore sachets of fragrant herbs around their necks to ward off disease, especially during times of plague. The strong scent was thought to cleanse the air, protecting the wearer from harmful miasmas, the foul vapors believed to spread sickness. Rosemary, sage, and rue were especially common in these protective bundles, their sharp scents offering both comfort and a sense of safety. Healing with herbs was not the work of physicians alone. Midwives, wise women, and local healers often had the deepest knowledge of which plants grew in their region and how to use them. These community healers might be called upon to deliver babies, treat wounds, or provide remedies for common ailments. Their wisdom was practical, drawn from years of observation and trial. While some of their cures worked, others were based on tradition, faith, or superstition. Still, in villages and towns, these women were essential to the survival of their neighbors. Herbal remedies also carried a spiritual weight. Many were blessed with prayers or gathered under certain conditions, such as during a full moon or at dawn on a holy day. The act of collecting plants could be a ritual in itself, filled with meaning beyond the physical act. In this way, medicine and magic often blurred together, each reinforcing the belief that healing came from both nature and the divine. To picture herbal medicine in the Middle Ages, imagine a small cottage on the edge of a village. Bundles of dried herbs hang from the rafters: sage, thyme, lavender, and marigold. A mortar and pestle rests on the table, ready to crush roots into powder. A healer moves quietly among her jars, selecting a mixture for a coughing child or a poultice for a wounded farmer. Outside, in the garden, rows of plants sway in the breeze, each one a potential remedy, each one a lifeline. Herbs may seem simple, but for centuries, they were the foundation of medicine. Even today, many of our modern drugs trace their origins back to these plants. The medieval world may not have understood the science behind them, but they recognized their power, and they used them with hope, faith, and sometimes remarkable results. As we leave the world of herbs behind, we step into a different, more dramatic side of medieval healing, the realm of the surgeon, where knives, saws, and courage were the tools of the trade. While monks and herbalists offered gentle remedies, there was another side to medieval medicine that was far harsher and far more terrifying. This was the world of the surgeon. To step onto a surgeon's table in the Middle Ages was to step into a place of pain, courage, and uncertain outcomes. Without anesthesia, without antiseptics, and without modern knowledge of the body, surgery was a desperate gamble, attempted only when no other choice remained. The work of the surgeon was considered lower in status than that of a physician. Physicians dealt with theories, humors, and the guidance of the stars, while surgeons dealt with flesh, blood, and bone. They were practical men, often trained as apprentices rather than in universities. Some came from the ranks of barber-surgeons, men who cut hair and shaved beards, but also learned to wield knives for bloodletting and small operations. In the eyes of the elite, surgery was a trade, not a science. But for the common people, the surgeon's skills could mean the difference between life and death. The operations themselves were grim affairs. A patient with a deep wound might be stitched up with coarse thread, the edges of the cut pulled together roughly. Broken bones were set as best they could be, often with wooden splints or crude bandages. If infection spread too far, amputation was sometimes the only option, carried out with a saw while the patient was held down by others. There were no numbing drugs to dull the pain. Instead, strong drink might be offered, or a piece of leather pressed between the teeth to bite down on. The screams of the patient filled the air, and survival depended on strength, luck, and the skill of the surgeon. Cauterization was another common practice. To stop bleeding or close a wound, surgeons would heat an iron until it glowed red, then press it against the flesh. The searing pain was nearly unbearable, but it could prevent a patient from bleeding to death. Infection, however, was a constant danger. Without understanding germs, surgeons often reused instruments without cleaning them, and wounds were left open to the air. Many patients who survived the operation itself later died from the fever and sickness that followed. Yet surgery was not without progress. Over the centuries, some surgeons developed remarkable techniques for their time. They learned how to remove arrows and other foreign objects with care, how to treat fractures with traction, and even how to perform rudimentary forms of trepanning drilling into the skull to relieve pressure after head injuries. While these procedures sound shocking, they sometimes worked, and the patients who lived owed their lives to the boldness of their surgeons. Surgery was also shaped by the battlefield. Wars provided both tragedy and opportunity, as surgeons were forced to treat countless wounds quickly and with limited resources. On campaign, they learned how to improvise, using whatever materials were at hand. Boiling oil, though dreadful, was sometimes poured into wounds to cleanse them, and makeshift splints were fashioned from branches or shields. In these harsh conditions, skill and innovation advanced out of necessity. To imagine the surgeon's world, picture a dim chamber, lit by torches, or a single window. A man lies on a table, pale and trembling, while a surgeon sharpens his knives. Assistants stand ready to hold him down, their faces tense with dread. There is no sterile smell, only the heavy scent of sweat, blood, and smoke from the cauterizing iron. The procedure begins, and the room fills with the sounds of pain and determination. It is a scene both brutal and brave, a testament to human endurance in the face of suffering. Despite the risks, surgery gave hope. For some, it offered a chance at survival when all else had failed. And while many perished, others lived, carrying scars that told stories of their surgeon's courage. In time, the lessons learned on these rough wooden tables would lay the foundation for the science of surgery we know today. From the surgeon's table, our journey now moves to another haunting figure of medieval medicine, the plague doctor with his beaked mask and air of mystery, standing at the edge of one of the darkest chapters in history. Few images of medieval medicine are as haunting or as memorable as that of the plague doctor. Cloaked in long black robes with gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and a beaked mask that jutted forward like the face of a bird, the plague doctor was a figure both of fear and of hope. To see one enter your town was to know that death was near, for their presence meant the plague had come. And yet, in their own way, these doctors represented one of humanity's earliest attempts at protective medicine. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, changed everything. It killed millions, wiping out entire villages and leaving deep scars on society. People did not understand that the plague was carried by fleas on rats. Instead, they believed it spread through the air, carried in foul miasmous poisonous vapors that seeped into the lungs. To fight against this unseen enemy, physicians crafted protective clothing designed to shield them from the deadly air. The most striking part of the outfit was the mask. The beak, often stuffed with strong-smelling herbs like lavender, mint, or cloves, was thought to filter the air. Sometimes sponges soaked in vinegar were placed inside, the fumes believed to ward off infection. The mask's round glass eyes gave the doctor a strange, almost inhuman appearance, turning him into a figure of nightmare. But behind this eerie disguise was a desperate attempt at survival, a recognition that something in the air was dangerous, even if its true nature was unknown. The rest of the costume was just as carefully designed. A long leather or waxed cloth coat covered the body, meant to keep disease from clinging to the skin. Gloves and boots completed the outfit, sealing the doctor from head to toe. In one hand, the plague doctor often carried a wooden staff. This served several purposes. It allowed him to point or prod without touching, to keep desperate patients at a distance, and perhaps even to defend himself from the fearful crowds. Despite the sinister appearance, plague doctors were hired by towns to care for the sick, record the dead, and sometimes perform rudimentary treatments. They might lance buboes, the painful swellings caused by the plague, in hopes of releasing the infection. They might apply poultices of herbs or administer mixtures meant to balance the humors. In truth, little they did could cure the disease. But their presence offered some structure in the chaos, some sense that the community was not entirely abandoned. For those who lived through it, the plague doctor became a symbol of the strange mixture of science, superstition, and desperation that defined medieval medicine. To a frightened child peering from a doorway, the figure with the bird-like mask must have seemed like a creature from another world, part priest, part demon, part healer. To adults, the doctor was both a comfort and a reminder of death's nearness. His costume, while unnerving, gave hope that anyone, was trying to fight the invisible terror. The plague left a deep mark on the collective memory of Europe. Songs, poems, and art of the time reflected the despair and the omnipresence of death. And yet, the plague doctor's outfit stands out as one of the earliest forms of protective clothing, an ancestor to the masks and suits used in modern medicine. While the theory behind it was flawed, the intention was clear: to shield the healer from harm and allow him to continue his work. Imagine a narrow medieval street, cobbled and dim. The smell of sickness hangs heavy in the air. Doors are marked with red crosses, signaling the plague within. Down the lane comes the slow, deliberate step of a figure in black. The mask's beak points forward, herbs hidden inside, the eyes glinting faintly in the light. People turn away, whisper prayers, and clutch charms, knowing that wherever he walks, death is close at hand. Yet still, he moves forward, doing the work few others dared to attempt. The plague doctor is a reminder that even in the darkest times, humans seek ways to adapt, to protect, and to fight back. His costume may look strange to us now, but in his own age, he was both a symbol of dread and a fragile flicker of hope. From this eerie figure, we move next into another realm of belief that shaped medieval healing, the conviction that the stars above could influence the body below. In the Middle Ages, medicine was not limited to herbs, bloodletting, or surgery. The sky itself was seen as a powerful guide in matters of health. To the medieval mind, the stars and planets above were deeply connected to the human body below, and physicians often turned to astrology to diagnose illness and determine treatment. It may sound strange to us now, but for centuries, healing was written not only in books, but also in the heavens. The belief that the cosmos influenced human life stretched back to ancient Babylon and Greece. By the time of the Middle Ages, these ideas had blended with medical theory to form a system where astrology was considered essential to understanding health. Each part of the body was thought to correspond to a sign of the zodiac. Aries ruled the head, Taurus the neck, Gemini the arms, and so on, all the way down to Pisces, which governed the feet. A chart of the stars could, therefore, reveal which part of the body was vulnerable at a given time. Physicians trained in astrology often cast horoscopes for their patients. The position of the moon, planets, and constellations could influence when it was best to perform a treatment. Bloodletting, for example, was only to be done when the stars were favorable. Certain days were considered unlucky for surgery, while others were thought to increase the chances of success. Even the timing of taking a medicine could be dictated by the heavens. In this way, astrology gave structure to medical practice, adding a sense of order to the unpredictable world of illness. The humors, too, were tied to the stars. Each humor corresponded to certain planets and elements. For instance, blood, warm and moist, was linked to Jupiter and the element of air, while black bile, cold and dry, was connected to Saturn and the earth. A physician who knew astrology could read the sky and decide which humor was out of balance, then design a cure to restore harmony. To them, medicine was not just about the body, it was about the harmony between the body, the earth, and the heavens. Astrology also influenced the preparation of remedies. Some herbs were believed to be ruled by specific planets, and their power was strongest when harvested under the right sign. For example, herbs associated with Mars, the planet of fire and strength, were thought to be effective in treating fevers or wounds, but only if gathered when Mars was in a favorable position. These practices gave an extra layer of ritual to herbal medicine, blending natural observation with celestial belief. Of course, not everyone accepted astrology. Some church leaders criticized it as superstition, warning that too much faith in the stars could lead people away from God. Yet many monks, physicians, and scholars quietly used astrology alongside their other practices, believing that God had set the stars in place for humanity to read and understand. To them, the heavens were a divine text, as full of meaning as any scripture. Imagine a physician in a quiet chamber, unrolling a parchment chart of the stars. By candlelight, he studies the movement of the planets, marking their positions carefully. Outside, a patient waits anxiously, hoping the doctor will declare the right time for a treatment. The air is thick with incense and anticipation, for health itself seems to hang in the balance of the night sky. The healer, after long calculation, nods and prescribes a remedy, confident that the stars have revealed the path to recovery. Astrology may not have been a science by modern standards, but it offered something precious in an uncertain world: the belief that illness was not random, but part of a larger cosmic pattern. For those who suffered, this brought comfort. If the stars could cause sickness, then perhaps they could also guide the way back to health. In this way, astrology gave meaning where there might otherwise have been only fear. From the glittering heavens above, our journey now descends once more to the earthy, physical realm of medieval medicine, to a practice as common as it was painful: the art of bleeding and leeching. Of all the treatments practiced in the Middle Ages, none was more common, more widespread, or more dreaded than bleeding. Whether by knife or by leech, the removal of blood was considered one of the most effective ways to restore balance to the body. Rooted in the theory of the four humors, bloodletting was a practice that touched every level of society, from kings in their castles to peasants in their cottages. To fall ill often meant facing the sting of a blade or the slow pull of a leech. The logic seemed simple to medieval physicians. If illness was caused by an excess of blood, then the solution was to draw that blood out. Fever, inflammation, headaches, and even melancholy could all be blamed on too much blood in the system. A physician, consulting his charts and humoral theory, would decide how much blood to remove and from where. Sometimes bleeding was localized, meant to draw sickness from a particular organ. At other times, it was more general, intended to cleanse the body as a whole. One method was venesection, the cutting of a vein. A patient would sit or lie down while the physician tied a band tightly around the arm to make the vein swell. With a sharp knife or lancet, he would then open the vein, letting the blood flow into a bowl. The amount removed might be measured carefully, or it might simply continue until the physician decided enough had been taken. The sight of blood spilling forth was both frightening and reassuring, a visible sign that the sickness was being drained away. Another, gentler method involved leeches. These small, slippery creatures were kept in jars of water, ready for use. When placed on the skin, they latched on with tiny teeth and began to draw blood slowly and steadily. Patients often found the sensation unsettling, though less immediately painful than the cut of a knife. The leeches would swell as they fed, eventually dropping off once satisfied. Some healers believed that leeches had a wisdom of their own, choosing the right amount of blood to take and the right place to bite. In this way, the humble leech became a trusted ally in the art of healing. Bleeding was not only a treatment for illness, but also a form of prevention. Wealthy nobles sometimes underwent regular bloodletting to maintain their health, much like a modern person might schedule routine checkups. It was thought that removing excess blood kept the body balanced and strong. Records show kings and queens submitting to the practice, trusting their physicians to keep them well through careful control of the humors. Yet the results were often harmful. Patients weakened, fainted, or even died from excessive loss of blood. Infections could set in at the site of the cut, turning a supposed cure into a deadly wound. Still, the faith in bleeding was so strong that its failures were often blamed on the patient as constitution, or on the timing of the procedure, rather than on the practice itself. It remained a cornerstone of medicine for centuries, long after its dangers should have been clear. The ritual of bleeding carried with it a strange mixture of fear and hope. Imagine sitting in a dim chamber, a bowl placed beside you, the physician sharpening his lancet. The air smells faintly of iron and herbs. Your arm is tied, the vein bulges, and then the blade touches your skin. Warmth rushes out, a slow stream of crimson filling the vessel. You feel lightheaded, unsure if relief or death is drawing near. Around you, attendants murmur prayers, and the doctor watches closely, measuring each drop as though it were the very essence of your health. For the leech, the scene was different. Nestled against the skin, it drank steadily, unaware of the theories and hopes that surrounded its task. To the medieval healer, the leech was both tool and symbol, a creature that bridged the natural and the medical, taking what was harmful and leaving the body renewed. Bleeding may seem barbaric to us now, but in its time, it was a logical extension of the humoral system, an attempt to restore harmony in the only way people knew. And while it often harmed more than it helped, it persisted because it fit the worldview of the age, that sickness was in balance and that healing required sacrifice. As we step away from the bloodied bowl and the swollen leech, we turn to another force that shaped medieval medicine, the power of belief itself. For alongside herbs and knives, magic and superstition played a vital role in the healing practices of the Middle Ages. Medicine in the Middle Ages was never purely physical. Alongside herbs, bleedings, and prayers, there existed a deep undercurrent of superstition and magic. To the medieval mind, illness could come not only from an imbalance of humors or a wound gone bad, but also from unseen forces, spirits, curses, or the evil eye. To protect against these threats, people turned to charms, spells, and rituals that blurred the line between healing and magic. Amulets were among the most common protections. A small pouch might be filled with herbs like rue or sage, then worn around the neck to ward off sickness. Crosses, relics, and written prayers were carried close to the body, believed to shield the wearer from harm. In times of plague, some wore gemstones, convinced that their brilliance could repel disease. Others trusted in coins or tokens, inscribed with holy symbols, small shields against the invisible dangers that surrounded them. Spells and incantations also played their part. A healer might whisper a charm while preparing a remedy, invoking saints or angels to bless the medicine. Some believed that repeating certain words could drive illness from the body, especially if spoken at dawn or under a particular phase of the moon. The line between prayer and magic was often thin, with both rooted in the desire for comfort and control in a world where sickness struck without warning. The use of magical remedies was not always harmless. Some involved unusual or even unsettling ingredients. Powdered bones, ground into potions, were thought to carry healing power. Animal parts, like the heart of a toad or the feathers of a bird, might be included in charms. Even human remains, such as powdered skull, found their way into certain cures, though these practices were more whispered than openly approved. To modern eyes, these remedies seem bizarre, but to the people of the time, they were part of a world where everything held meaning and power. Superstition also influenced how illnesses were understood. The evil eye, the belief that envy or malice could be cast through a glance, was thought to cause fevers, weakness, or misfortune. To protect against it, people wore charms shaped like eyes, or carried herbs like fennel and garlic. Witchcraft, too, was often blamed for unexplained illness, and accusations could fall quickly on women who practiced healing outside the bounds of church or community approval. The fear of magic was as strong as the reliance upon it. Yet not all superstition was dark. Many rituals carried a sense of hope and comfort. A mother might tie a ribbon around her child's wrist, believing it would keep away coughs. A farmer might place a charm above the door of his cottage, guarding the family within. Even if these practices held no physical power, they offered reassurance, and in times of uncertainty, reassurance itself was a kind of medicine. The church had an uneasy relationship with magic. Officially, superstition was condemned as dangerous and heretical, yet many of the faithful continued to blend Christian prayer with folk practices. Pilgrimages to holy sites were encouraged, where relics of saints were believed to heal the sick. A drop of water from a sacred spring, a touch of a saint's bone, or the blessing of a priest could all be seen as cures. In practice, the spiritual and the magical often walked hand in hand. Imagine standing in a small village cottage, the air heavy with the smell of herbs and smoke. On the table lies a charm bag, stitched together with rough thread, inside packed with dried rosemary and sage. A healer mutters words over a steaming cup of tea, her voice low and rhythmic, while a candle flickers in the dim light. Outside, the church bell tolls, reminding the villagers that prayer, too, is part of the cure. In this world, healing is as much about faith and fear as it is about herbs and knives. Superstition may seem unscientific, but it reveals a timeless truth. People need hope. When medicine failed, when fevers rose and wounds festered, magic filled the gap, offering comfort where knowledge fell short. It was a way of making sense of the unknown, of giving illness a cause and healing a path. From these charms and rituals, we move now into another realm of medieval healing, one where the stakes were highest and the risks immense, the world of childbirth, midwives and the challenges faced by mothers and infants in an age without modern care. Among the greatest trials of medieval life was childbirth. For women, the act of bringing new life into the world was a moment of both hope and danger. Without modern medicine, sterile tools, or safe hospitals, the risks were immense. Many mothers did not survive labor, and countless infants were lost in their first days. In this uncertain world, midwives stood as guides, caretakers, and guardians of life, carrying with them knowledge passed down through generations. Midwives were often women of the community, experienced in childbirth not through formal study, but through long practice. They had attended dozens, sometimes hundreds of births, and their skill was born of observation, memory, and intuition. They knew how to comfort a laboring mother, how to position her for delivery, and how to recognize when complications threatened. Though their tools were simple, their presence brought reassurance at a time when every birth was a journey into the unknown. The birthing chamber was far different from what we know today. Instead of sterile hospital rooms, childbirth took place in the home, often in a warm, dimly lit room prepared with cloths, herbs, and wooden stools. Family and neighbors might gather nearby, offering prayers or tending to the household, while the midwife focused on her work. The atmosphere was one of both intimacy and tension, filled with whispered encouragement and the cries of pain that accompanied labor. Herbs were often used to ease the process. Drinks infused with rue, fennel, or anise were believed to strengthen contractions. Warm compresses soothed aching muscles, while oils rubbed into the skin brought comfort. Charms and prayers were just as important, for childbirth was seen not only as a physical ordeal, but also a spiritual trial. The midwife might place a relic or a cross nearby, or speak words meant to protect mother and child from harm. In a world where death hovered close, every layer of protection was welcome. The risks, however, were ever present. Prolonged labor could exhaust the mother beyond recovery. Breech births, where the child came feet first, were especially dangerous. Without surgical intervention, many mothers and infants did not survive such complications. Hemorrhage was another constant threat, one that even the most skilled midwife could not always stop. For many families, joy and grief were intertwined, the birth of a child shadowed by the loss of a mother, or the arrival of new life cut short by death. Despite these dangers, midwives were deeply respected, though sometimes feared. Their knowledge of herbs and rituals placed them on the edge of suspicion. In times of hardship, accusations of witchcraft could fall upon them, especially if a birth ended badly. Yet in most communities, midwives were indispensable. They carried the wisdom of survival, and their role was honored in ways both spoken and unspoken. Midwives did more than deliver babies. They also offered care in the days after birth, tending to the mother's recovery and guiding her through the fragile early weeks. They knew how to prepare nourishing broths, how to soothe fevers, and how to advise on breastfeeding. Their role extended into the spiritual realm as well, for they were sometimes asked to perform emergency baptisms if a newborn's life was slipping away. In such moments, the midwife was not just a healer, but a bridge between life and death, between earth and heaven. To picture this world, imagine a small cottage, the fire glowing in the hearth, the air filled with the mingled scents of herbs and wood smoke. A woman labors in the corner, her hands gripping the arms of a birthing stool, sweat on her brow. Beside her, the midwife kneels, calm and steady, speaking softly, her hands skilled and sure. Outside, family members wait in anxious silence, straining to hear the first cry of the infant. Hours pass in effort and pain until at last the newborn's voice breaks through, thin and piercing, a fragile sound of life in a dangerous world. Childbirth in the Middle Ages was never easy, but it was sacred. It was a moment when the boundaries between life and death, hope and despair, seemed at their thinnest. Midwives stood at that threshold, guiding mothers and infants as best they could, armed with little more than herbs, experience, and faith. Their work was often unrecognized by scholars or physicians, but it was essential to the survival of communities. From the struggles of childbirth, we turn to another painful corner of medieval medicine, one that dealt not with the womb, but with the mouth. For in the absence of modern dentistry, caring for teeth was a grim and often agonizing affair. If there was one kind of pain that medieval people dreaded above most others, it was toothache. Long before the world had dentists' chairs, novocaine, or careful cleanings, the care of teeth was crude, harsh, and often more painful than the illness itself. In the Middle Ages, a simple cavity could lead to days of misery, and an infected tooth might swell until it threatened a person's very life. Dentistry, such as it was, existed in a world of improvisation, superstition, and sheer endurance. Teeth were seen through the lens of humoral theory, like the rest of the body. A toothache might be blamed on an excess of black bile, or on vapors rising from the stomach into the head. Remedies were designed to restore balance, sometimes by purging, sometimes by bleeding from the gums, and often by applying strange poultices to the jaw. Garlic, onion, or vinegar might be pressed against the cheek, the sharp taste and smell believed to draw out the sickness. Powdered herbs mixed with honey were smeared onto the gums, offering some comfort, even if only briefly. When pain grew unbearable, extraction was often the only solution. This was not done in a clean office with shining instruments, but in markets, workshops, or barber stalls. Barber-surgeons and itinerant tooth pullers carried with them crude pliers and tongs, ready to grip and yank a diseased tooth free. There was no anesthesia. The patient would be held steady by friends or assistants, perhaps given a strong drink to dull the senses. Then, with a swift jerk or sometimes several painful twists, the tooth was torn out. The scream that followed echoed through the room, a sound familiar to every medieval town. These extractions were often performed in public, especially by traveling tooth pullers who set up at fairs and markets. They were part healer, part entertainer, drawing crowds with promises of relief and displays of daring. Some even wore bright costumes, turning their work into a spectacle. For the audience, it was both horrifying and fascinating, a reminder of the thin line between suffering and healing. For the patient, it was a desperate gamble, taken in the hope that the agony of the toothache would finally end. Superstitions surrounded dental pain as well. Some believed that worms caused tooth decay, burrowing into the enamel and gnawing away from within. This idea lasted for centuries, supported by the shapes seen in decayed teeth. Remedies were designed to drive the worms out, fumes of burned herbs directed into the mouth, or powders meant to smoke them away. While the theory was wrong, the treatment sometimes eased pain temporarily, which only confirmed the belief. Preventive care, as we know it, hardly existed. People used twigs or cloves to rub their teeth, and herbal rinses made from mint or sage were sometimes swished in the mouth. But sugar, increasingly available in medieval Europe, began to take its toll, leading to more decay than in earlier centuries. For the wealthy, sweets became both a luxury and a hidden curse, eroding the very smiles that marked their status. To imagine medieval dentistry, picture a bustling marketplace. A barber-surgeon stands beneath a canopy, his tools laid out on a rough wooden table. A man, pale with pain, sits on a stool, clutching the arms of his chair. The surgeon grips a pair of iron tongs, positions them against the tooth, and with a brutal pull, wrenches it free. The crowd gasps, the patient cries out, and the bloody tooth is held aloft like a trophy. In that moment, the agony is replaced by a different kind of suffering, yet for many, it was the only path to relief. Despite its brutality, medieval dentistry was not entirely without merit. Extraction, though harsh, often saved lives by preventing dangerous infections from spreading deeper into the body. The use of herbs and rinses, while primitive, hinted at the beginnings of oral care. And over time, as knowledge grew, these painful practices laid the groundwork for more careful treatments in later centuries. From the grim world of tooth pullers, we move next to the larger institutions of care that began to emerge in the medieval world, the hospitals, where the sick gathered not only for healing, but also for shelter prayer and the hope of mercy. When we hear the word hospital today, we picture bright lights, sterile halls, and doctors moving briskly between patients. But in the Middle Ages, hospitals were something very different. They were places of refuge as much as healing, often run by religious orders and guided more by charity and faith than by medical science. To step into a medieval hospital was to enter a space where body and soul were treated together, and where care meant comfort as much as cure. The first hospitals in medieval Europe were closely tied to the church. Many were founded by monasteries or cathedrals, built as extensions of Christian duty. Caring for the sick was seen as a sacred obligation, a way to serve God by serving those in need. Hospitals were also meant to receive pilgrims, travelers, and the poor people who often had nowhere else to turn. In this sense, the medieval hospital was as much a shelter as a place of medicine. Inside, the setting was simple. Patients were often housed in large halls, lined with rows of beds or straw mattresses. Privacy was rare, and the air was filled with the mingled sounds of coughing, groaning, and prayer. The smell of herbs and incense tried to mask the odors of sickness, while candles burned steadily in the dim light. At the far end of many hospital halls stood an altar, so that patients could see the priest celebrating Mass, even from their beds. Healing was inseparable from devotion, for the salvation of the soul was considered just as important as the recovery of the body. The staff of these hospitals were often monks, nuns, or lay brothers and sisters trained in basic care. They washed patients, prepared simple meals, and administered herbal remedies. They prayed with the sick and offered comfort to the dying. Physicians, when present, were few in number and usually reserved for wealthier patients, but the spiritual caretakers were always at hand. The focus was on kindness and relief, even when cures were beyond reach. Medicine in these hospitals varied. Herbal infusions were given for fevers, poultices applied to wounds, and diets adjusted according to humoral theory. Bloodletting might be carried out in some cases, though often the religious caretakers leaned toward gentler remedies. The sick were encouraged to confess, receive communion, and prepare their souls for whatever outcome awaited. For many, the hospital was less about healing and more about dying well, with dignity and spiritual peace. Some hospitals specialized in particular kinds of care. Leper houses, for example, were built on the edges of towns, offering a place for those afflicted with leprosy to live apart from the healthy population. While treatment for leprosy was limited, these institutions gave shelter, food, and community to people otherwise shunned. Other hospitals served the poor and destitute, providing not just medical aid, but also a roof and a bed for those in need. Hospitals were also important centers of charity. Wealthy patrons donated land or money to establish them, seeing such gifts as acts of piety that might secure favor in the afterlife. To build or fund a hospital was a way to demonstrate devotion, and inscriptions on walls or documents often recorded the names of those who gave. In this way, hospitals became monuments of both compassion and legacy, standing as symbols of a community's care for its weakest members. Imagine lying in a hospital bed in the Middle Ages. Around you, other patients rest on straw pallets, their faces pale, their bodies thin. The murmur of prayers drifts through the hall, mingling with the scent of burning incense and rosemary. A nun passes quietly, placing a bowl of warm broth at your side. Beyond the rows of beds, you see the flickering candles of an altar and hear the soft chanting of the priest. The hospital is not a place of miracles, but it is a place of solace, where suffering is eased by presence, if not always by cure. Though these institutions lacked the scientific rigor of modern medicine, they embodied the values of compassion, care, and community. They remind us that healing is not only about science, but also about comfort and dignity. In the medieval world, where death was ever near, hospitals offered a final gift, the assurance that no one faced illness alone. From these quiet halls, we turn to another chapter of medieval health, the struggle to contain disease itself. Through quarantines and isolation, as societies fought desperately against the spread of epidemics. Epidemics were among the greatest terrors of the medieval world. Disease could sweep into a town without warning, spreading rapidly and leaving devastation in its wake. With little understanding of germs or contagion, communities turned to the tools they had: isolation, quarantine, and strict rules designed to hold back the tide of sickness. Though imperfect, These measures marked some of the earliest attempts at public health, born of desperation and necessity. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. In the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean, like Venice and Dubrovnik, ships arriving from regions known to harbor plague were required to wait offshore before passengers or cargo could come ashore. At first, the waiting period was 30 days, later extended to 40, reflecting the belief that this length of isolation would allow the disease to reveal itself. Sailors and merchants chafed at the delay, but the practice saved countless lives by slowing the spread of infection. Quarantine was not limited to ships. Within towns, houses struck by illness were sometimes marked and sealed, the inhabitants locked inside until the danger had passed. Guards were posted at city gates to prevent the sick from entering, and travelers were turned away if they came from plague-ridden regions. Markets and fairs were canceled, churches closed their doors, and entire villages cut themselves off from the outside world in hopes of surviving the storm of disease. These measures were harsh, but in the absence of other defenses, they were often the only hope. Fear drove many of these actions, and fear could be as devastating as the sickness itself. Families sometimes abandoned their own members to avoid infection, leaving the ill to die alone. Strangers were shunned and travelers suspected. Yet there were also acts of courage and compassion. Some communities organized care for the quarantined, bringing food to doorsteps or offering prayers at a distance. The balance between fear and duty shaped every epidemic, testing the bonds of society. The plague, of course, was the most infamous epidemic of the medieval period, but it was not the only one. Leprosy, smallpox, and recurring waves of fevers all demanded containment. Leper houses served as permanent forms of quarantine, separating those afflicted for life. Town councils issued ordinances against spitting in public, against dumping waste in the streets, and against gathering in large numbers, all early recognitions that human behavior influenced the spread of disease, even if the mechanism was unknown. Religious responses played a role, too. Processions, prayers, and fasts were held to beg God for mercy. Some believed epidemics were punishments for sin, and entire towns repented in hopes of relief. Others turned to scapegoats, tragically blaming outsiders, minorities, or accused witches for the spread of sickness. In these moments, fear fueled both unity and division, bringing out the best and worst of human nature. Imagine a medieval port, the ships bobbing just beyond the harbor walls. The townsfolk watch anxiously from the shore, knowing that within the holds might lie riches, goods, and trade, but also the seeds of death. Bells toll as the council declares the quarantine, and the vessels must wait, their crews restless, their fate uncertain. On land, narrow streets are quiet, shutters closed, red crosses painted on doors to mark the infected. Life slows to a fearful stillness, the air heavy with silence and dread. Though medieval quarantine was born from limited knowledge, it revealed a growing awareness that sickness could spread from person to person. It was a recognition of patterns, a practical step in a world still grasping for answers. These measures did not stop every epidemic, but they often slowed them, buying time and saving lives. They were the beginnings of public health, fragile yet profound. From the silence of locked doors and waiting ships, we turn now to another source of knowledge that shaped medieval healing: the ancient texts and wisdom of past civilizations, preserved and adapted across centuries. In the Middle Ages, medicine did not exist in isolation. It was built upon a foundation laid by the civilizations that came before, especially the Greeks, Romans, and later, the scholars of the Islamic world. Their texts, carefully preserved and copied, formed the backbone of medical learning for centuries. To heal in the medieval world was often to look backward, to seek wisdom from the ancients whose words carried the weight of authority and tradition. The writings of Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, and Galen, the Roman physician, dominated medical thought. Hippocrates had emphasized observation, careful recording of symptoms, and the idea that disease had natural causes rather than being purely divine punishment. Galen expanded on these ideas, creating a vast body of work that explained the body through the four humors, anatomy, and treatment methods. For medieval physicians, Galen was the voice of authority. His works were copied in monasteries, studied in universities, and quoted in medical texts across Europe. But the Middle Ages were not a time of stagnation. In the Islamic world, scholars such as Avicenna and Rhazes expanded and refined ancient knowledge. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, written in the 11th century, became one of the most influential medical texts of all time. It synthesized Greek and Roman learning with new observations and experiments, offering a comprehensive guide to diagnosis and treatment. Translated into Latin, it spread across Europe and became a standard reference in medical schools for centuries. Rhazes, too, contributed works on diseases like smallpox and measles, distinguishing them from one another with clarity unmatched in Europe at the time. The process of transmission was long and intricate. Arabic texts were translated into Latin in centers of learning like Toledo, where scholars worked tirelessly to make this knowledge available to the West. Monks and scribes carefully copied manuscripts, illuminating them with diagrams and notes. Through these efforts, medieval Europe gained access to a treasure trove of medical wisdom, blending the ancient with the contemporary. Medicine became a shared heritage, crossing borders of language, religion, and culture. For the medieval physician, to quote Galen or Avicenna was to stand on solid ground. Their authority lent weight to diagnoses and treatments, and to deviate from their teachings was often seen as dangerous or arrogant. Yet even within this reverence, there were sparks of innovation. Some healers questioned the old texts when observations did not align. Surgeons, in particular, often found that the realities of wounds and bones challenged the theories of the ancients. Slowly, a tension grew between tradition and experience, a tension that would one day give rise to modern medicine. The influence of ancient texts also shaped how medicine was taught. Universities such as Salerno, Montpellier, and Bologna became renowned for their medical faculties, where students studied the works of Galen and Avicenna as part of their training. Lectures were often little more than readings of these texts, with commentary by the master. Practical experience was limited, but the emphasis on learning from the ancients instilled a shared language and framework across Europe. A physician trained in one country could converse easily with another, for they spoke the same language of humors, elements, and planetary influences. Imagine a scholar in a candlelit chamber, a thick manuscript open before him. The words of Galen flow across the page in Latin, the margins filled with notes from generations of readers. Nearby, another text lies open, Avicenna's Canon, its Arabic origins still faintly visible in the script. The student copies carefully, his hand aching, but his mind alive with the sense that he is touching a chain of knowledge stretching back through centuries. For him, these books are not simply texts, they are lifelines, guiding the way through the mysteries of illness and health. The reliance on ancient knowledge shows the medieval desire for continuity, for the wisdom of the past to illuminate the present. While it sometimes limited innovation, it also preserved invaluable insights that might otherwise have been lost. In many ways, medieval medicine was a bridge, carrying the legacy of Greece, Rome, and the Islamic world into the Renaissance, where it would be questioned, tested, and transformed. From these scholarly halls and treasured manuscripts, our journey now returns to the streets and shops of medieval towns, where barber-surgeons practiced their trade, blending the work of grooming with the dangerous art of surgery. Among the more unusual figures of medieval medicine was the barber-surgeon, a man who could trim your beard, cut your hair, bleed your veins, and if need be, cut into your flesh. To us, these seem like very different professions, but in the Middle Ages, grooming and surgery were closely linked. The barber's tools, razors, knives, and steady hands were as useful for opening veins as they were for shaving faces. And so, across Europe, the barber surgeon became a familiar figure, straddling the line between everyday service and life-saving intervention. Barber surgeons gained their skills not through universities or scholarly study, but through apprenticeship. A young man might begin by sweeping floors and sharpening razors in a shop, slowly learning the craft of shaving and hair cutting. Over time, he would be introduced to the medical side of the trade, bleeding customers to balance their humors, lancing boils, pulling teeth, or even stitching wounds. By watching and imitating his master, he acquired practical experience. Unlike physicians, who dealt in theory and diagnosis, barber surgeons dealt in flesh and blood, their work immediate and physical. Their most common service was bloodletting. Customers came to them not only for a trim, but also to have a vein opened in the arm, releasing what was believed to be excess blood. The barber surgeon tied a band, pricked the vein, and collected the flow in a small bowl. This practice was so closely tied to their profession that the striped pole we still see outside barbershops today has its origins here. The red representing blood, the white bandages, and the pole itself, the staff the patients gripped during the procedure. But their work went beyond bleeding. Barber surgeons were often called upon to handle injuries, especially in towns where physicians were scarce or expensive. A farmer with a deep cut, a soldier with a wound from battle, or a villager with an infected abscess might all seek help from the local barber. He would clean the wound as best he could, apply poultices, and stitch the skin with coarse thread. Though far from sterile, these treatments sometimes succeeded, and the barber surgeon's reputation grew. Tooth pulling was another common task. Armed with iron pliers or a hook-like tool, the barber surgeon would grip the offending tooth and wrench it free, much as described in earlier chapters. For those suffering unbearable pain, he was both feared and needed, the one man in town who could bring relief, however brutal. In some places, barber surgeons even performed amputations, though this was dangerous and often deadly. Still, in emergencies, their willingness to act set them apart. Despite their skills, barber surgeons were often looked down upon by university-trained physicians, who considered them little more than tradesmen. Physicians diagnosed and prescribed, while surgeons cut and stitched. The division was clear. Theory belonged to the elite, practice to the working man. Yet it was the barber surgeon who often stood closest to the people, tending to their everyday needs and risking his hands in the messy work of healing. The barber surgeon's shop was a place of community as well as care. Men gathered not only for haircuts, but for conversation, gossip, and advice. Within this setting, the blending of grooming and medicine seemed natural. One could walk in shaggy and unwell and leave both trimmed and treated. The hum of voices, the clink of razors, and the scent of herbs created an atmosphere that was part social hub, part clinic. Imagine stepping into such a shop. Wooden stools line the walls. The air carries the scent of soap and smoke, and tools gleam on a table. A man sits in the chair, his face lathered for shaving, while another waits with a band tied around his arm, ready for bleeding. Outside, the striped pole turns in the wind, its colors announcing to all that within these walls, hair is cut, beards are trimmed, and blood is drawn. In this modest space, medicine and daily life meet in their most practical form. The barber surgeon reminds us that medieval medicine was not confined to monasteries or universities. It lived in the marketplace, in the hands of men who combined everyday trade with the risky art of healing. Their work, though often rough, kept communities functioning, bridging the gap between theory and need. From these busy shops and their striped poles, we turn now to the larger question of public health itself, how towns and cities struggled with sanitation, waste, and the challenge of keeping their populations safe in a world where disease was never far away. In the crowded towns and growing cities of the Middle Ages, health was shaped not only by medicine, but also by the environment in which people lived. Streets were narrow, houses were packed tightly together, and sanitation was often poor. Disease thrived in these conditions, carried by dirty water, foul air, and the pests that flourished in the shadows. Public health, as we think of it today, barely existed. Yet communities did attempt to manage their surroundings, sometimes with surprising foresight, sometimes with little more than desperation. Waste was one of the greatest challenges. Human refuse was often emptied into the streets or poured into open ditches that ran alongside homes. Rain might wash it away, but more often it pooled and festered, breeding foul smells and spreading illness. In larger towns, cesspits were dug, but when they overflowed, the stench could be overwhelming. Regulations were issued in some places, forbidding people from throwing waste directly into the streets, but enforcement was uneven. For many, filth was simply part of daily life. Water supplies, too, were precarious. Wells provided drinking water, but they were easily contaminated by nearby waste pits. In some cities, aqueducts and fountains brought cleaner water, remnants of Roman engineering or newer efforts by civic leaders. But the poor often relied on rivers and streams, where water was shared with animals and used for washing clothes, tanning hides, or even disposing of carcasses. The line between water for life and water for disease was perilously thin. Animals added to the challenge. Horses, pigs, chickens, and dogs roamed freely through towns, leaving droppings in the streets. Rats and fleas multiplied in this environment, carrying the plague into homes and markets. In the countryside, animals were essential for work and food, but in the crowded city, they became vectors of illness. Authorities sometimes ordered the removal of pigs or other animals from urban centers, but the rules were difficult to enforce. Despite these problems, communities did make efforts to improve health. Town councils passed laws requiring butchers to work outside city walls, moving the mess and smell of slaughter away from the heart of town. Bathhouses offered places for washing, though their use varied depending on the region and the period. Streets were occasionally cleaned, especially after outbreaks of disease. In times of plague, bonfires were lit to purify the air, and barrels of vinegar were placed in public squares in the hope that their fumes would drive away sickness. Religious belief shaped public health as well. Processions were held to bless the town, to ask God's mercy in times of epidemic, or to purify spaces thought to be tainted. Bells rang, incense burned, and prayers rose into the sky, mingling with the smoke of cleansing fires. Though these rituals did little to halt disease, they offered a sense of unity and purpose, binding communities together in the face of fear. Sanitation also reflected social divisions. Wealthy households often had private latrines, cleaner water, and larger spaces, while the poor lived crowded together in filth. Yet even the rich could not escape entirely, for disease crossed walls and doors with ease. Plague and fever did not respect wealth, and outbreaks swept through noble halls as well as peasant huts. This shared vulnerability was a reminder of the fragile balance of life in the medieval world. Imagine walking down a medieval street. The cobbles are uneven, the air thick with smoke from cooking fires. A stream of dirty water trickles through the center, carrying refuse toward the river. Chickens peck at scraps, while a dog noses through a pile of waste. A woman draws water from a well, her bucket splashing, unaware that the liquid may carry unseen dangers. Above, the cries of merchants and the tolling of church bells fill the air. It is a place alive with energy, but also with risk, where health and sickness live side by side. These challenges remind us that medicine alone could not protect people. The very spaces they inhabited shaped their health, often in ways beyond their control. Yet even amid the filth and fear, people sought order, passing laws, building fountains, and lighting fires to push back against the tide of disease. Their efforts were imperfect, but they were the beginnings of a recognition that health is not just personal, but communal. From the crowded streets of medieval towns, our journey moves toward the dawn of change, the gradual shift from medieval medicine to Renaissance learning, where old ideas began to give way to new discoveries, and the seeds of modern science were sown. By the later Middle Ages, the world of medicine was beginning to change. Slowly, quietly, the seeds of the Renaissance were being planted, and with them came a new curiosity, a willingness to question the authority of the past. For centuries, medicine had been bound to the theories of the four hewers, the teachings of Galen, and the weight of tradition. But as scholars, surgeons, and explorers pushed the boundaries of knowledge, the medical world began to look forward rather than only backward. One of the most important shifts came from direct observation. Surgeons, who had long worked with the body in practical ways, began to emphasize the value of anatomy. In some universities, dissections of human corpses were permitted, though often under strict supervision and with religious oversight. These dissections revealed that not everything Galen had written was correct. His texts, based largely on animal dissection, contained errors about the human body. The discovery of these mistakes opened the door to questioning long-accepted truths. The invention of the printing press in the 5th–10th century transformed the spread of medical knowledge. Before, manuscripts were copied by hand, limiting their availability. Now, texts could be reproduced quickly and distributed widely. Works like Avicenna's Canon and Galen's treatises were printed and reprinted, but so too were newer writings that challenged or expanded upon them. Medical knowledge became more accessible, reaching scholars, physicians, and students across Europe. The exchange of ideas quickened, feeding the hunger for discovery. Travel and exploration also played a role. As Europeans ventured beyond their borders, they encountered new plants, spices, and remedies from distant lands. The discovery of these unfamiliar substances broadened the range of medicine, introducing new cures and challenging old practices. Cinnamon, cloves, and other exotic ingredients made their way into apothecaries, blending with traditional herbs. Some of these imports were valued as luxuries, but others found their place in healing, expanding the medieval pharmacy into something more global. Universities, too, grew in importance. Centers like Padua and Bologna became hubs of medical teaching where students debated texts, observed dissections, and learned from both ancient authorities and living masters. The emphasis on scholastic learning remained strong, but a spirit of questioning began to rise. Physicians still honored Galen and Hippocrates, but they no longer accepted every word without scrutiny. This slow shift from blind reverence to critical inquiry marked the dawn of modern medicine. Art and science intertwined in this transformation. Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci studied the human form with meticulous care, producing anatomical drawings that revealed muscles, bones, and organs with astonishing accuracy. These works were not only beautiful, but also educational, bridging the gap between art and medicine. They reflected a new spirit of curiosity, an eagerness to see the body as it truly was, rather than as tradition had described it. Despite these advances, much of medieval practice continued. Bloodletting, astrology, and humoral theory still held sway over many physicians and patients. Change was slow, and belief in the old ways lingered. Yet beneath the surface, the ground was shifting. The Renaissance spirit of inquiry was loosening the grip of tradition, preparing the way for the scientific revolutions of the 17th century. Imagine standing in a university hall in the late 15th century. A professor, robed in black, reads from a printed copy of Galen, while beside him a body lies open for dissection. Students crowd the benches, some scribbling notes, others peering closely at the exposed organs. The words of the ancients mingle with the sight of real flesh, theory and practice meeting in uneasy harmony. In this moment, the medieval world of medicine begins to tilt toward something new. The shift toward Renaissance medicine was not a sudden break, but a gradual evolution. It was the blending of old wisdom with new discovery, of tradition with curiosity. It reminds us that knowledge grows not only by preserving the past, but also by daring to question it. The Middle Ages had laid the groundwork. The Renaissance would build upon it, leading humanity toward a deeper understanding of the body and the mysteries of health. From this threshold of change, we turn to our final reflection, a return to the heart of our journey, to consider once more why you would not last a day without medieval medicine, and what this strange, difficult, and remarkable world reveals about the resilience of the human spirit. We have traveled through the world of medieval healing, from the humors to herbs, from monasteries to plague doctors, from barber-surgeons to hospitals, and into the dawn of Renaissance inquiry. Each step has revealed a world both fragile and resilient, where life balanced constantly on the edge of illness and death. Now, as we reflect on it all, we can see why you would not last a day without medieval medicine. In the Middle Ages, sickness was everywhere. A simple wound could fester into a deadly infection. Childbirth was a perilous trial. Toothache could become life-threatening. Epidemics swept through towns, carried by air, water, and vermin. Without medicine, even medicine shaped by error and superstition life would have been unbearably harsh. Every community depended on its healers, whether they were monks with their herb gardens, midwives with their steady hands, surgeons with their blades, or wise women with their charms. To live without these healers would have meant to face illness entirely alone. Imagine a fever burning through your body, with no one to bring cooling herbs or whispered prayers. Imagine a broken bone left untreated, a wound left to rot, a toothache with no relief. However limited their tools, medieval healers provided hope. Their remedies, though often crude, gave comfort. Their presence, their rituals, their faith offered a sense that illness could be faced, not merely endured. We may look back and shudder at bloodletting, at leeches, at cauterizing irons. We may shake our heads at astrology charts and amulets, at prayers mixed with powders of bone. Yet to the people of the time, these practices made sense. They were attempts to understand, to control, to bring order to the chaos of sickness. And in some cases, they worked herbs soothed pain, honey healed wounds, and quarantines slowed the spread of plague. Even the flawed practices carried within them the seeds of learning, the steps toward the medicine we know today. To say you would not last a day without medieval medicine is not to suggest it was perfect, but to recognize that without it, survival itself would have been impossible. Medicine, however flawed, was a lifeline. It was the difference between a wound that healed and one that killed, between a birth that brought joy and one that ended in tragedy. It was the foundation upon which modern healing was slowly built, brick by uncertain brick. Imagine for a moment stepping into that world without access to its remedies. No herbs to soothe your cough, no midwife to guide childbirth, no surgeon to set your broken bone, no hospital to offer shelter in illness. Alone, you would quickly discover how fragile life truly was in the Middle Ages. It was only through the efforts of countless healers, men and women, trained and untrained, devout and practical, that communities endured. They may not have had the knowledge we possess today, but they had determination, compassion, and the will to try. This, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of medieval medicine. It shows us that healing is not only about science, but about the human need to care, to help, and to hope. The world of the Middle Ages was filled with danger, yet it was also filled with resilience. People did not simply surrender to sickness. They fought it with every tool they had, however strange or flawed. And in that struggle, they laid the path for us to walk today. As we close this journey, let the story of medieval medicine remind you of the endurance of the human spirit. Without it, no one would have lasted a day. With it, flawed though it was, humanity endured, survived, and prepared the way for the brighter knowledge to come. And so, our long journey through the world of medieval medicine comes to an end. We have walked among monasteries, where monks tended herb gardens and copied ancient texts. We have stood at the surgeon's table, felt the sting of leeches, and watched the eerie figure of the plague doctor walk the streets. We have entered the homes of midwives, the halls of hospitals, and the crowded markets where barber-surgeons worked their trade. We have seen how astrology, superstition, and tradition intertwined with observation and experience, shaping a medical world both fragile and fascinating. What this history shows us is not only how people once lived, but also how deeply humans have always sought to ease suffering. Even in times of fear and uncertainty, healers offered hope. Their remedies, their prayers, their courage flawed, though they were kept life moving forward. Without them, survival in the Middle Ages would have been impossible. With them, humanity endured, and step by step, prepared the ground for the medicine we know today. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to subscribe to Asterisk History for Sleep Asterisk, so you can always return for more calming explorations of the past. I would love to hear from you as well. Leave a comment sharing what history topics interest you most and when you listen in. Do you drift off with these stories at night, play them during restless hours, or let them guide you through the quiet of your day? Your thoughts help shape where we travel next together. For now, let your mind rest. Close your eyes, slow your breathing, and let the echoes of this history fade into gentle silence. The world of medieval medicine, with all its strangeness and struggle, is behind us. What remains is peace, a story told, and the quiet comfort of rest. Good night, and may sleep come easily.